two motor systems. So the dorsal visual stream can guide action, but ultimately the signal has to get to the muscles through the spinal cord. How? Well, the primary motor cortex sends signals to the spinal cord. It is right anterior to the central sulcus, which is a very visible major landmark delineating the boundary between the parietal and frontal cortices. When I say anterior to the central sulcus, I mean that it is right in front of it. Sometimes we call the primary motor cortex just the motor cortex, or M1. This patch of the brain is also sometimes called the precentral gyrus. A gyrus is just a ridge between sulci. Precentral just means anterior to the central sulcus. The interesting thing about the motor cortex is that it is also spatially organized. It has what is called a motor map, which maps to different parts of the body. Different muscles for the hand, for instance, are driven by neurons close to each other, and they are far away from the neurons driving muscles in, say, the foot. The motor cortex is also lateralized. The left M1 controls the right side of the body and vice versa. The visual information from the dorsal visual stream eventually goes to M1 to guide action. But there's one step in between, the lateral premotor area shown in yellow here. The lateral premotor cortex, or just premotor cortex, is right anterior to M1. Lateral here just means being on the side rather than medial, like the supplementary motor area, SMA, shown in green. So why do we need this intermediate area? One way to think of it is in terms of hierarchy and complexity again, a bit like the visual system. M1 is just one synapse away from the spinal cord. It has a motor map, meaning that the neurons are responsible for muscle activity in specific body parts. But oftentimes an action is complex, like jumping or grasping something, and involves many muscles in different body parts. Neurons in the lateral premotor cortex code for these more complex actions rather than individual muscular contractions. So this is the pathway in which visually guided action happens, from the eyeballs, to LGN, to V1, through the dorsal stream extrastriate areas to the parietal cortex, to the lateral premotor cortex, and eventually to M1. But remember that this is only for fast, online reactions to external stimuli. Sometimes we act spontaneously without external trigger. Or what about the perceptual matching task that patient DF did and failed? There, we make use of ventral visual stream information to first consciously recognize what we see and then deliberate how we act. How does the information go from the ventral stream to the motor cortex? The answer is, it goes through the lateral prefrontal cortex, PFC, which is further anterior to the premotor cortex. PFC is a rough term, often used to include many specific regions concerned here. Specifically, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC, is the most relevant, but let's not be too bothered by the details for now. What is important to know is that the prefrontal cortex, and DLPFC in particular, can be considered to be the final converging point of the dorsal and ventral visual streams. This is where they both come together, the what and the where. Unlike the motor areas, the lateralization of the DLPFC is not very clear. Both sides seem to do similar functions. When one side is damaged, the other side can take over the same jobs as well. From DLPFC, commands for deliberate actions can be formed based on the combination of both dorsal and ventral stream visual information. They can then be sent to the supplementary motor area, SMA, which receives input mainly from the prefrontal rather than the parietal cortex, unlike the lateral premotor area. From SMA, the motor command can then go to M1. The SMA, besides being in between the DLPFC and M1, is important for spontaneous actions too. Passingham and his colleagues trained monkeys to learn that they would be rewarded with food if they raised their arms. But after their SMA was lesioned, they no longer did so unless auditorily cued for action. Apparently, they still understood that raising their arms would get them food, but when there was no external sound prompting them to act, they would no longer act on their own. So here's something a bit more complicated to think about. Where does this spontaneous urge to move come from? It sounds almost magical that it comes from just one area, like this is the seat of our free will. But we don't actually know for sure where the origin of the spontaneous signal is. It could be from the SMA itself, but it could also be from another area, such as the DLPFC. If the SMA is lesioned, it might block the pathway from the DLPFC to M1 as well. So we haven't yet found free will in the brain. This is, of course, a very deep and complicated question, and we're going to talk about it a bit more later on in the course.